Chapter 7. "We have just one more place to visit," Aunt Gardner told Elizabeth as their carriage crawled through the streets of the city. They had been seeing to errands all morning. Elizabeth had agreed to accompany her aunt while Jane had wished to remain at home with the children. Therefore, Aunt Gardner and Elizabeth had had ample time to talk about many things. The chief topic of interest for Aunt Gardner had been the gentleman who had called with his sister on Friday, Monday and Tuesday. "The orphan house?" Elizabeth asked. "Yes, Mrs. Verity's." Aunt Gardner sorted through her parcels to find the one that Elizabeth knew contained 2 shirts and 3 petticoats. "It is not much," she said, as she found the correct parcel and placed it on her lap, "but it will be appreciated. Mrs. Verity relies not only on her own funds, substantial though they are, but also on the generosity of her friends to meet every need of her charges." Mrs. Verity was a wealthy widow, who, having no children of her own, had chosen to use the money left to her by her husband to set up a house for orphans. Her intention was not just to give them a safe place to live, but to educate them in every area of life that might afford them a proper future, free of crime and filled with hope. At least that is how Aunt Gardner had described it. Elizabeth had to admit she was curious to see what an orphan house looked like. There was nothing of that sort in Hertfordshire, and the idea of a lady running her own establishment and aiding the less fortunate intrigued her. "Mr. Darcy seemed disappointed yesterday when you refused his offer of a drive in the park." Elizabeth's reply was a tight smile. Aunt Gardner sighed. "He is a fine gentleman, handsome and rich, and quite obviously besotted with you. I do not know why you insist on repelling his every advance." Elizabeth wished she had an answer for that herself, or at least one that did not show her in such a poor light. "I have been such a fool, Aunt. I cannot see him without being reminded of my shame." "Pride is a dangerous thing, Elizabeth." Her aunt tipped her head and looked at her very seriously. "Just apologize." Elizabeth pulled the corner of her bottom lip between her teeth and winced at that one word. "Oh, it will smart for a time to be sure," her aunt continued, "but then it will be done." Elizabeth knew it was true. The proper thing to do was to gather her courage and admit her folly. "He will hate me," she admitted in a whisper. Her aunt's brows rose. "And you wish for him to not hate you?" "Yes." Elizabeth could feel her face turning red. "I believe I have wanted him to not hate me ever since the assembly at Michaelmas. I had hoped when I saw him enter, and when his friend paid attention to Jane, that he might consider me." She looked down at her hands. "But he did not." It was the first time she had admitted how much Mr. Darcy's slighting comment had humiliated her. She had managed until this moment to wrap that pain in indignation and anger. "Oh, my Lizzie!" Her aunt reached across the carriage and grasped Elizabeth's hands. "Then let him love you now. He is a good man. Do you not believe that?" Elizabeth nodded. "He does seem to be a good and kind brother." "He cares very well for his sister," Mrs. Gardner agreed. "I know many who would not treat a daughter, or sister, with such care after making such a scandalous plan as to elope with a ne'er-do-well. Why, there is one young lady who has found herself in Mrs. Verity's care, after being caught with a beau of whom her father did not approve. Miss Darcy was not ruined as this girl was, but still, to be cast out in such a way," she shook her head. "And you know as well as I do that she is one of the fortunate ones to have found a good place to live until she can find a position where she can earn her keep." Again Elizabeth nodded. Everything that she had seen or heard about Mr. Darcy since she had arrived in town spoke of his goodness. "I am being foolish, I know." Her aunt patted her hand. "Learning to love is a fearful prospect." Love? The word jumped from Elizabeth's lips. She did not love Mr. Darcy. She admired him, she found him attractive, she even found his company to be pleasant, but she did not love him. Her aunt smiled as the carriage drew to a stop. "Yes, my dear, that is the opposite of hate." Elizabeth's mouth dropped open and then snapped closed. "Just because I do not want him to hate me does not mean I love him. It means... She stammered indignantly. "You value his good opinion," her aunt completed, "and when not having it can threaten to rend your very soul, then it is time to consider just how deeply you admire the gentleman. Do not be stubborn about this, Elizabeth, or you may lose something that cannot be replaced." Elizabeth pressed her lips together and followed her aunt out of the carriage and up the steps to Mrs. Verity's door. Mrs. Gardner. A lady with dark hair, streaked with thin ribbons of grey, greeted Elizabeth's aunt as she and Elizabeth entered a spacious study. The walls were lined with book-filled shelves. There was a grouping of chairs near a hearth, and another pair tucked in a window alcove. At one side, a large desk stood before two more chairs. It was to these chairs that Mrs. Verity directed her visitors. "I have some shirts and petticoats," Mrs. Gardner said as she placed the parcel she carried between two neat stacks of papers on the desk. "This is my niece, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth, this is Mrs. Verity, the capable head mistress of this fine establishment." "Oh, be seated." Mrs. Verity waved away Mrs. Gardner's compliments and chuckled. "Your aunt is always attempting to swell my head even more than it is already swollen." "I speak only the truth," Mrs. Gardner retorted with a grin. "Well then, I shall leave that to Miss Elizabeth to decide." Mrs. Verity arranged herself in the chair behind the desk and picked up a paper. "This is the young lady who is seeking a position," she said, handing the paper to Mrs. Gardner. "And this is the lad in need of an apprenticeship." She handed a second sheet of paper to Elizabeth's aunt. "We instruct all our residents in every useful skill," she explained to Elizabeth. "Both boys and girls are taught to read, write, and do their sums. The boys practice various skills such as placing and removing things from a table without being a distraction, tying cravats, planting, caring for animals, working with their hands, and when an aptitude in one or another of these skills is noted, we attempt to find them a place where they can earn both a bit of money and experience. Master Riley shows an inclination to be very good with figures. He's not meant to work with his hands, he must work with his mind." "My husband thinks he would do well with Mr. Crenshaw," said Mrs. Gardner. "He may lodge here, if there is no place for him there." Mrs. Verity turned her attention to Mrs. Gardner, who assured her that all the necessary arrangements would be in place before Riley began any work. "The girls, such as Miss Clara, are taught cooking, cleaning, tending to and instructing young ones, as well as stitching and the like." Mrs. Verity continued her explanation to Elizabeth. "Clara has a love for fashion and can ply a needle and thread with great skill." "Mr. Gardner will surely know of a mantua maker in need of an assistant," Mrs. Gardner assured Mrs. Verity. "I see that Miss Clara is also skilled at making bonnets," Mrs. Gardner said, as she continued looking over the sheet of paper she held. "Would she be inclined to work with a milliner?" "She would indeed. Again, lodging is available here if required, but if a place can be found for her as well as Riley, that provides living arrangements, then I can take in 2 new children." Mrs. Gardner nodded her head. "We will see what we can do." "You always do," Mrs. Verity said with a smile. "Now your niece has not been here before. Would you care for a tour, Miss Bennet?" Elizabeth looked hopefully at her aunt. Mrs. Gardner laughed. "I dare say I shall not hear the end of her disappointment if we do not have a tour. Elizabeth is an industrious sort of young lady, who might need a charity in which to be involved after she's married." "And is marriage in the near future?" Mrs. Verity asked as she led them from the room. "No," Elizabeth answered as her aunt replied. "Possibly." Mrs. Verity laughed. "The hopeful aunt. But I can see why she is hopeful. You are a lovely young woman." Elizabeth blushed and thanked Mrs. Verity for her compliment. "Is there a particular gentleman?" the headmistress of the orphan house asked Mrs. Gardner. "I cannot say," Mrs. Gardner replied, while allowing her eyebrows to flick, in a manner that told Mrs. Verity that there was indeed a particular gentleman. Elizabeth shook her head. "Aunt," she pleaded. "Very well," said Mrs. Verity. "We shall pursue that topic no further. This room on your left is where the children take all their meals. After they reach a certain age, they are required to take their turns in serving, not just because they may some day be employed in a fine home, but because there is value in learning to serve others." The room was furnished just as a dining room in a wealthy estate might be furnished. "It is beautiful," Elizabeth murmured. "I give them the best," Mrs. Verity said. "They must learn to work in such places as this, so they must be familiar with both sides of the room, so to speak, those who eat and those who wait." She led them down the hall and up a set of back stairs. "The children are required to use these stairs at all times unless descending for lessons. I will show you the classroom last." She led them through the halls, showing them this room and that and introducing each child she met to the ladies. Elizabeth smiled and curtsied in response to each polite greeting she received. It was evident that Mrs. Verity and her staff had taught the children very well, and from their clear complexions and bright eyes, they were all well fed and happy. After touring the upper levels, Mrs. Verity took them down to the storehouses and kitchen, before returning to the floor on which they had begun their tour. "There were 2 drawing rooms and a library when I first purchased the house," Mrs. Verity explained as she stood outside a closed door. "We have kept one drawing room for receiving guests, and the other 2 rooms have been converted into schoolrooms. This is the room for receiving guests," she said as she pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a young woman sitting near the window stitching. Elizabeth stopped and stared at the woman. She looked very much like the maid who had delivered the tea to the drawing room at Darcy House. "Does she work here?" she whispered to Mrs. Verity. "No." Mrs. Verity paused. "Not all of our children are orphans. Some, such as Nelly's son, are foundlings." "Nelly?" Elizabeth whispered. "It was Mr. Darcy's maid." Mrs. Verity nodded. "She keeps her son here so that she can continue to work. A maid cannot care for a child and fulfill her duties." "She has no husband?" "No, she has never had a husband," Mrs. Verity said softly. "Maids can fall prey to the gentleman of a house." Elizabeth's stomach felt as if it had dropped to her toes. "And that is what happened to Nelly?" "Yes." The one-word answer made Elizabeth blink at sudden tears. How could she even consider a man who would take advantage of one of his maids in such a way? "How sad," she muttered, both because it was a dismal realization about the man she admired, and because it was sad that a maid should be treated so. "Indeed it is. However, Nelly's employer allows her to visit regularly and be involved in her son's life. That is much more than most foundlings are ever given. Her son will be along to see her soon." She looked at the pocket watch which hung with several other baubles and keys on a chain around her waist. 10 more minutes and reading time will be over, and Robert will be free to visit with his mother. Elizabeth followed Mrs. Verity to the next door. As I mentioned before, the remaining rooms were made over into classrooms, one for the older children and one for the younger ones. The 2 rooms are connected by a door, and from time to time, the younger and older children learn together. She cracked the door open slowly and whispered, "Such as now." It is good for all ages to hear literature read aloud, even if they cannot decipher the words themselves. She held a finger to her lips and did not open the door any further, allowing them to listen to what was being read. "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things." The rich, familiar baritone of the reader wafted into the hall, wrapping itself around Elizabeth's heart with a deep sadness that ran exactly opposite of the sentiments of the poet. She fought to maintain control of her emotions. Mrs. Verity motioned her forward and pushed the door open just a bit further. Elizabeth peered into the room. A dozen children of various ages sat attentively listening. Some sat on the floor, others in chairs, and one small boy with blonde curls snuggled into Mr. Darcy's shoulder. Elizabeth looked from that young boy to Mrs. Verity. "That is Nelly's son, Robert," she whispered. Her words snatched the air from Elizabeth's lungs. The room felt warm and her legs unstable. "I need a bit of air," she said, and quickly fled the sight of the man whom she loved and who was holding his maid's son.